Greetings everyone, I am Mohammad Tavakkoli, the inaugural director of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. I welcome you to the Institute's Iranian Studies book launch featuring Professor Farshid Emami's recently published book, Isfahan, Architecture and Urban Experience in Modern Iran. Professor Emami, welcome to Toronto and thank you for accepting our invitation. I am also grateful to the sponsors of today's book launch, the Department of Near and Middle Eastern Civilizations, the Canadian Society for Iranian and Persian Studies, the Iranian Studies Student Forum, and the Roshan Cultural Heritage Institute, which has generously funded the establishment of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. At the outset, I would like to express our collective and individual gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people across Turtle Island. We are grateful to have the opportunity to live, learn, and teach in their ancestral homeland. My colleague, Professor Ruba Kan'an, will introduce Professor Emami and moderate today's session. Please.
Thank you so much, Mohammed, and thank you all for being here on a Friday afternoon on a snowy day. We're here to celebrate a new book, a beautiful book, Isfahan, Architecture and Urban Experience in Early Modern Iran. It's the recent book of Farshid Emami, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Art History at Rice University in Houston, Texas. And we thoroughly apologize for the weather. It must be a shock for your system.
It is shocking.
Before I introduce the book, I would like to thank Mohammed, Bilal, and definitely the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute for Iranian Studies for their enthusiastic response when I suggested that we should host a book launch for Professor Emami's book before the book was even published. And they put everything in motion. So thank you so much for this. And I hope this would be the beginning of long collaboration on seminars on art and architecture in Iran. Instead of introducing Professor Emami, who will talk to you about his talk, I want to just take you for a few minutes through introducing his book and what caught my attention in just 2 paragraphs, so that would be an introduction to you and what I thought the whole approach for this marvelous book is. The book is published in a series by Penn University Press on buildings, landscape and societies, and it is a beautiful series by definition. The books are very well researched, cutting edge in methodology, and they're beautifully produced, and as a result they're brilliant for a book like this, where Professor Emami has spent incredible time doing reproductions and of ancient maps, old images, and reproducing and reconstructing the lost architecture of Isfahan. The book itself is on Isfahan, 17th century, the imperial city, but it doesn't deal with the imperial city only from the formal sense of architecture, which is of course magnificent, and which is what grabs all of us to come here on a Friday afternoon to listen to a lecture on Isfahan. The book takes the architecture and reclaims the space for the individual, the person walking in Isfahan in the 17th century, for person enjoying a stroll in Isfahan or looking at the different landscapes in it. And I think for me, the way the book is divided into 3 separate sections. The first section is about the architecture, is about the imperial city. It sets the scene. It brings it up to date with the studies on Isfahan, and for that, it's wonderful. There are 2 words that keep to concepts, one word and one concept that sort of kept pressing themselves, the word of tarh, design, and of course that whole concept of pairing rhythm and symmetry in design. In the second part, he takes us to the spaces and experiences, and then he talks about coffee houses and gardens and landscapes and the different quarters of the city. And there the language focuses on the individual, on the concepts of sayr and suhba, on the concept of nazira as a pairing of, an aesthetical pairing of designs. And then he leads to the third section, which is the section where he reads the landscape of the city through poetry, not descriptive but experiential. He looks at that unique experience of 17th century poems, describing not the monuments of Isfahan, but the walking in Isfahan, the being in it. And through that, Professor Emami presents us with a book that is both beautiful, informative, and it is it's a new way in which the field of studying architecture in the Muslim world in general is leading to. And for that, we thank you and we look forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you so much, Professor Kanan, for the very, very generous introduction. I very much appreciate it. I'm grateful for the invitation. Thank you so much, Professor Tawakkoli, for the invitation, and to the Institute of Iranian Studies here in the University of Toronto. I also want to thank Dr. Bilal Hashmi for coordinating my visit today. And thank you, everyone, for being here. I appreciate it. So I'll start. Sometime in the middle years of the 17th century, a young poet named Mir-Rukneddin composed a letter to his friend and fellow poet Mansur Semnani. In ornate, rhymed prose interspersed with poems, Rukneddin wrote of his excruciating solitude since Semnani's departure from Isfahan, noting how strolling in gardens or sitting in coffeehouses evoked memories of their joint urban excursions. To entice his friend to return, Rukneddin particularly highlighted the newest architectural addition to Isfahan's urban landscape, the Hassanabad or Khaju Bridge. If only a bit were written on the glory of the heavenly Hassanabad Bridge, he wrote, one would swiftly set off for Isfahan. In response, Semnani penned a more substantial missive. Confining his expressions of sorrow to a brief passage, he composed an elaborate guide, Dastur al-Amal, for a one-day excursion in Isfahan, noting that the proposed itinerary must not be violated. After complaining of separation and expressing a penchant for meeting, a guide on the subject of strolling the markets, roving flower gardens, and beholding comely faces is written by the pen of expression. One is by no means to stray nor to deviate from this path. And yet, despite the claim of brevity, Semnani's guide offers an enticing representation of Safavid Isfahan. Alternating between prose and verse, it takes the reader through the city's markets, coffee houses, plazas, and mosques, and describes Isfahan's artisans, coffee servers, performers, and courtesans. The chief characters of the urban tour are the city's young male craftspersons. Following the poetic convention known as Shahrashub or city disturber, these youthful attractions are described in an amorous tone through metaphors drawn from the commodities they sell or the crafts in which they are engaged. The itinerary also includes stops at architectural monuments such as a royal palace known as the Talar Tavile, Hall of Stables, the shrine of the city's patron saint, Harun Velayat, and Isfahan's new congregational mosque, Masjid al-Shah. Isfahan's monuments and inhabitants' senses and pleasures are interlaced to craft a lyrical urban image as seen from the viewpoint of a desiring, mobile male subject. In the mid-17th century, when Semnani penned his guide to the pleasures of Isfahan, the city was at the apogee of its prosperity and splendor. Although Isfahan had been a thriving urban settlement since early medieval times, it was the massive building campaigns instigated by Shah Abbas I that set the stage for the urban experiences echoed in Semnani's work. Subduing tribal factions, Shah Abbas created a standing army of slave soldiers and a centralized bureaucracy and expanded the productive forces and mercantile connections of Safavid territories. It was under Shah Abbas that the capital was transferred from Qazvin to Isfahan, a city more centrally located on the Iranian plateau. Safavid building activities in Isfahan were primarily implemented outside the walled city on the banks of the Zayanda River. Abbasabad was inhabited primarily by long-distance traders who hailed from Tabriz. New Jolfa was home to a community of Armenian Christian merchants who were involved in international silk trade and were forcibly relocated to Isfahan from their homeland in the Caucasus. And Gabrabad was inhabited by Zoroastrians who were moved to Isfahan from the cities of Yazd and Kerman. Zoroastrians were primarily engaged in gardening and agriculture, so they were not as well off as merchant inhabitant communities of Abbasabad and New Jolfa, but their labor was central to the upkeep of the city's extensive gardens. Together with Old Isfahan, these three corridors formed the cosmopolitan capital city that shaped and represented Safavid mercantile aspirations and political policies under Shah Abbas. The central axis of the new Isfahan was the Charbagh, a 4-kilometer-long tree-lined promenade running from the palace complex to the Hezar Jarib Royal Garden in the foothills of the Sofa mountain. Bordered by sensuous gardens, lofty pavilions, and bustling coffee houses, the Chaharbagh functioned as a public venue for leisurely strolls and an urban thoroughfare linking the city center to extramural gardens and corridors. The Safavids, of course, also established a new civic center in Isfahan, the famed Meydan-e-Nakhsh-e-Jahan, image of the world square. Adjoining the palace complex and surrounded by religious foundations and imperial monuments, this immense plaza hosted communal ceremonies, equestrian sports, and the daily lives of the city's inhabitants. Created through a coordinated planning process, the urban spaces of Isfahan were a means of establishing a new socio-political order. And these aspects of Isfahan's urbanism can be best appreciated through diagrammatic drawings, such as the plan of the square we see here, or from an elevated viewpoint, like the bird's eye view we see here. But there was another way of experiencing and imagining the city that was multisensory and kinetic, embodied and subjective. In place of the planned arrangement of urban elements in these ground-up urban representations, it is the movement of sensing bodies that gives coherence to the city and its components. And it is precisely this mode of subjective multisensory engagement with the urban environment that underlies Semnani's guide for strolling in Isfahan. Instead of an imposing spectacle, here the city appears to be a swirl of senses, places, and persons. Semnani's composition does not merely cast the urban scenes of Isfahan in a lyrical, literary form. It reveals how the city's variegated components registered as a continuous socio-spatial reality in the mind of a feeling human subject. The urban experience that informs Semnani's guide to the pleasures of Isfahan lies at the core of my book, Isfahan, Architecture and Urban Experience in Early Modern Iran. What configuration of urban spaces, social institutions, and architectural monuments enabled and propelled this kind of engagement with the city? What historical forces, social ideals, and modes of urban design gave rise to a settlement where mosques, coffee houses, and courtesans could be encountered and represented in this manner? How was Isfahan perceived and imagined by contemporary individuals, and what can we learn about the city's image and culture through a study of embodied sensory encounters recorded in literary urban descriptions? These questions have not been subject to a sustained interdisciplinary analysis in the scholarship on the architecture and urbanism of Safavid Isfahan. And my interest in Isfahan was initially sparked by what I saw as the overemphasis of previous works on formal qualities of the urban environment or just aspects of courtly practice and patronage. I wanted to understand the city not as a set of grand designs or a stage for the enactment of royal power, but as a social arena that fostered human experience. At the same time, I realized that Isfahan's urban spaces were much more extensive than its central Maidan and restored monuments. The city's now vanished residential corridors, verdant thoroughfares, and social establishments were equally fundamental to the formation of lively urban experiences. In my book, I reconstruct the spaces and senses of Isfahan and narrate its story as a locus of social experiences. The book reveals the city as a dynamic setting that fostered new conceptions of urban existence, ones that were intimately bound up with the formal, natural, social, and sensual qualities of the urban environment. I consider spaces and experiences as a whole, and I reimagine in the book the urban experiences that animated the lives of urban dwellers and informed their perceptions of themselves, the city, and the world. I approach Isfahan from the critical lens of urban experience, which I define as a phenomenon engaging the body and mind. These are visceral encounters with the city that are simultaneously affected by cultural habits and inherited mindsets. My basic premise is that the city and the experience thereof are mutually constitutive. Just as urban spaces were influential in shaping social behaviors, so too were human experiences influential in shaping the city. And I'm happy to speak more about my theoretical inspirations in the Q&A. And in analyzing urban experiences, I draw extensively on literary sources. These are lesser known works in prose or verse that reveal a view of Isfahan from the ground up. And a study of these largely untapped corpus helps counter the over-reliance of the existing scholarship on European travelogues and court chronicles. And I see these corpus of works as speaking of the formation of a novel domain of cultural production and consumption in the city, which I see as a social train nurtured by the city and largely independent of courtly circles. So consisting of 9 chapters divided into 3 parts, the narrative of my book unfolds across the full arc from the conception and construction of the city to its sensory experiences and literary representations, laying the groundwork for the core discussions of the book. Part 1, Rise of the Metropolis, re-examines Isfahan's pre-Safavid history, planning trajectory, and urban configuration. Part 2 considers aspects of urban experience in the 3 major constituent parts of Safavid Isfahan: the Maidan, the Chaharbagh, and the extramural corridors. So in chapter 4, the first chapter of part 2, titled Sensing Time and Sound, Clocks and Rhythms of Urban Life, I deal with the oral and temporal dimensions of urban experience, focusing particularly on the Maidan and Nakhsh Jahan and its less known clocks and other audiovisual components. In this chapter, I argue that the mechanical clock installed on the north side of the square was an integral part of its design from the outset, and together with the Naqare Khane, kettle drum hall, and coffee houses, this mechanical clock. And there was another now lost clock pavilion that was built in the 1640s. Together, they created a distinctive soundscape, punctuated the flow of time, and regulated the rhythms of life in the Maidan and beyond in Isfahan. The socio-aesthetics of visual experience is the subject of the following chapter, which investigates the visual structure of the Chaharbagh. In this chapter, I recreate the embodied sensory experience of the promenade through the gaze of a mobile beholder and reimagine the architectural form and social experience of its coffee houses, taverns, and Sufi convents. Finally, the urban form and lived experience of the extramural corridors are addressed in chapter 6, built on a rectilinear pattern and accessed by tree-lined avenues. These quarters contrasted with the age-old compact urban fabric of the pre-Safavid walled town. In this chapter, I discuss the nature and character of the orthogonal blueprint of these quarters and show how they were linked to the city's social hierarchy and dynamism. In part 3, Lyrics and Subjectivities, I delve into the literary representations of Isfahan, concluding with the final chapter, Solitary Wandering and Civic Pleasures, a day-long journey in Isfahan, which is devoted to an in-depth scrutiny of the guide for strolling in Isfahan that I have edited and translated in the appendix based on the known manuscript versions. So in the rest of my talk, I will follow in the footsteps of the guide and discuss the new modes of experiencing the urban environment that informs its representation of early modern Isfahan. But before that, I wanted to offer just a brief overview of the text. So this is a epistolary composition between two friends. It is datable to 1660 based on internal evidence. It was first published in 1971 by Muhammad Taqi Daneshpaju. It didn't garner much attention until very recently. In recent time, historians such as Professor Kafrin Babayan and Professor Rasul Jafarian have also discussed this text. So what we know about the author is that Semnani, Mir Muhammad Mansour Semnani, was son of a poet born and raised in Semnan. It's a provincial city. He spends a few years in Isfahan together with Rukneddin. He was also a friend from Semnan. And then Semnani returns to his hometown, and we know that there he established a coffee house, which became the watering hole for the literati in the city, and he dies in 1732 or 33. So the text survives in 6 manuscripts. 3 of them date from late Safavid period. And what is interesting about these 3 versions is that all 3 were produced in provincial cities. One was produced in Ardabil, the other was in the city of Lar, and a third one in Mashhad. So it suggests that the text enjoyed a level of acclaim and in this period, although today we don't know much about these poets such as literary figures such as Semnani. And there are literary aspects to it. It's a shahrashu, but also it's an insha, epistolary composition. I pay attention to these aspects of it, but in the chapter I analyze it as a literary artifact and a spatial representation, and that's what makes it a novel cultural artifact of early modern Iran. Okay. So Semnani's recommended excursion in Isfahan begins at daybreak at a tobacco vending stall and the shops run by Armenian vendors. These were probably located to the northeast of the Maidan, as afterwards the text guides us toward the coffee houses and the royal market, Qaysariya, on the northern side of the plaza. In 17th century Isfahan, the coffee house was an entirely novel social institution. Coffee houses of the Maidan were the most famous ones in the city and were constructed as the main building program of the Maidan. Occupying the entire eastern wing of the plaza's northern side, they consisted of 6 domed halls, each approximately 7 meters across. And these domed chambers of the coffee houses were lit through apertures in the ceilings and featured octagonal basins at the center. And alternating with these domed halls were vaulted alcoves, which were outfitted with platforms used as a seating area for the clients. The coffee houses were directly accessible from the Maidan and also from the market lane in the north. So they kind of integrated the flow of urban life into their spatial structure. And these coffee houses do not exist in their original form. So these were my reconstructions based on what we know from earlier drawings and sketches, like the sketch made by the Italian traveler Pietro della Valle. And some of the original vaults of the coffee houses are still preserved in Isfahan, but these coffee houses have now been taken over by shops. The recommended path of our tour guide matches the configuration of coffee houses in the northeastern side of the Maidan. It reads, one should then head toward the Qaysariya via the paths running through the coffee houses and in the rear of the coffee houses. It is permissible to linger to smoke a water pipe, a qalyan, at the stall of Saleh Khawas Khan, and if one's temperament is inclined toward coffee, one can get a cup at the hand of Mirza Ashraf at the Khaja Ali coffee house. So in Isfahan, we know that each coffee house was known after the person in charge of it or a specific server. And here it's interesting, the author is referring to two of his favorites, Mirza Ashraf and Khaja Ali. And it's also interesting because drinking a morning coffee in a public coffee house was also a novel social habit in Isfahan. So by recommending getting a coffee in the morning, the visitor is sort of engaging in the new daily rhythms of the city. And here is my hypothetical reconstruction. One could go first, get a qalyan and smoke a water pipe. Then one could go to one of the coffee houses, get a cup of coffee, and then the coffee houses were interconnected. One could go through the coffee houses to the Qaysariya portal. And the coffee cups, we do have one coffee cup now in the installation at the Ram, but I mean, this was a new material artifact in Isfahan. They were manufactured and imported in large quantities. These are very small cups that were used for drinking coffee. After taking a cup of coffee at the Khaja Ali coffee house, one should proceed toward the entrance to the Qaysariya. Semnani describes the Qaysariya portal as, quote, the auspicious zodiac house of the star of felicity. And this seems to be an allusion to an astronomical imagery, which is the zodiac sign of Sagittarius. Medieval sources tell us that the Buid rulers built the city walls of Isfahan when the moon was in Sagittarius, and this was the auspicious zodiac house of the city. And in the Islamic period, most of the cities were associated with one particular star or constellation. And at the portal, the main attraction is the jewel vendor idol, and the text employs the imagery of precious stones to offer metaphors of love. One is advised to rest in front of the platform of the salab making and syrup selling stall to drink a cup or two of musk and ambergris scented salab. These stalls were most likely the shops of beverages or sherbet houses which flanked the Qaysariya portal. And salab is a hot starchy beverage made of orchid tubers, and it was particularly known in this period for its aphrodisiac power. It's no longer very common in Iran, but you can get it in Istanbul. It's very common in Turkey. And here's a photo of a cup of salab, very, very heavy drink. In any event, the lounging at the Qaysariya portal is not advisable just for the sake of drink, for directly in front of that shop would be the moon-like jewel vendor. And the visitor is first to take a direct glance, then to skillfully gaze at the beloved from a distance while relishing the aromatic beverage. In an innovative take on the Shahrashub themes, the two sensory pleasures available at the Qaysariya portal are merged by synesthesia. The sight of jewelry mingles with the taste and the smell of a cup of hot scented salab. One is then to explore the Qaysariya's interior in a seamless extended sentence containing a wide range of commercial terms and names of fabrics. The text conjures a vivid picture of the sartorial commodities found in the royal market. The incessant swirl of images conveys a sense of the space of the variegated textiles traded and made in the Qaysariya. The largest covered market of Isfahan, the Qaysariya, was a cosmopolitan center of trade where luxurious textiles and exotic commodities and even European paintings and prints were sold, and people of different ethnicities could be met. Not everyone had the means to afford the commodities and substances, of course, but all could take delight in being around them, seeking pleasure in the very same articles of trade whose circulation made such an urban exploration possible. After exploring the Qaysariya, the tour continues in the surrounding markets and the market of confectioners, Bazar Qannatha. But overall, it seems that Semnani's recommended tour begins with a stroll in the most bustling segment of Isfahan's market, where the city's unique artifacts and senses merge with metaphors of love to forge a lyrical urban portrait. But then the visitor gets hungry, and for further one, from there one should return to his chamber, hujre. On such a day, there should be no concern for eating and sleeping. But since nature is accustomed to food and the carnal soul is wont to eat and drink, one is to stop for an hour to have an early lunch, chasht, and one must be content with a rapidly prepared snack, mahazar. For a light meal, Semnani recommends two types of bread, sangak and lavash, and he specifies what bakery this should be gotten from. And then he names the specific types of cheese, yogurt, grape, peach, watermelon, and melon that the visitors should have. This is not really a light meal, this is not a snack, but this is a literary trope, right? He wants to give a sense of the whole range of foods and products that are available in Isfahan. And the reference to sangak is particularly interesting here because it's a thick bread made in a pebble-covered oven that was either invented or popularized in 17th century Isfahan. So it's sort of also advertising for this new type of bread that one could get in Isfahan. After the meal, one is instructed to visit yet another coffee house. The exact location of this establishment around the Maidan is not clear, but it appears that the atmosphere of this drinking house was fairly distinct from the coffee houses at the market, such as the Khaja Ali coffee house, where one could make a short stop for a cup of coffee, but there would be less time for lingering and relishing music and dancing. Semnani paints an animated picture of a festive, jubilant assembly of drunken revelers enlivened by music, singing, and dancing. Contemporary paintings offer a glimpse of the atmosphere of such festive coffee houses and their coffee servers. And youthful coffee and wine servers are frequently depicted in Safavid single-page paintings, and they would have been encountered in Isfahan's public coffee houses. Departing from the drinking house, the visitors return to the market around the Maidan. Passing through the shoemakers market, Bazar Kaffashan, one would reach the gateway of the palace complex, the Ali Ghapu. Here, the author recommends visiting the Talar Tavile, Hall of Stables, which was located just behind the Ali Ghapu and the palace ground, to behold European images, Tasavir Farang, or Christians of the European monastery, Tarsayan Deir Farang, and this is recorded differently in manuscripts. The now vanished Talar Tavile was located on the palace grounds, and since its erection in the 1630s, functioned as the court's main public reception hall. The secretary of the Duke of Holstein, Adam Olearius, who attended a festive audience at the Talar Tavile in 1637, saw European paintings displayed on the palace's wall, and these were just depicted as framed paintings. More striking, though, in this passage by Semnani is that no reference is made to royal presence. It seems as if the palace was an integral part of the city and the Maidan and could function as a public museum of some sort. European accounts suggest that Safavid royal palaces and gardens were generally open to the public, and here our text provides further evidence that this was a common practice even among the local elites, or at least the palaces were perceived as being accessible, where they could be, a visit to them could be suggested in this tour guide. After this short detour from the market, the visitor is instructed to go through the lane of lapidaries and the mirror market. Here, glass mirrors was another novel commodity in Isfahan. Mirrors in Iran were made of an entire Islamic lands of metals, but glass mirrors was introduced from Venice, so it was entirely new here. This is highlighted here. And going through the mirror market, one is going to reach the new congregational mosque of Isfahan, the Shah Mosque. Here there is an alluring druggist perfumer Attar in the stall facing that of Haji Tahir, where one could seek a cure for the incendiary fever of separation and the lethal sickness of desire. In the 17th century, the forecourt of the Shah Mosque would have been redolent of the scents emanating from the apothecary shops, enacting the olfactory sense of worshippers as they stepped into the dazzling sanctuary of Isfahan. Then, in a theatrical coincidence, just as the visitor reaches the mosque's gateway, comes the time for the noon worship, and, quote, the melodious muezzins stir uproar in the turquoise dome of the heaven. Here, the call to prayer functions not only as an oral signal, but also as a marker of the passage of time. Half a day has passed since the tour commenced at daybreak. Semnani takes us inside the mosque and describes the rows of worshippers attending the Friday noon prayer. So this visit to the Shah Mosque is a kind of watershed moment in the excursion, because after this point, a quick journey to the old city center of Isfahan is recommended. So the text says, after leaving the Shah Mosque, if supposedly it is a Friday and time is expanded, one is to don the robe of pilgrimage and set off to visit the old mosque, Masjid Kohneh. The old Maidan and the Masjid Jame Kohneh was linked to the Maidan Nakhsh Jahan by way of a 2-kilometer-long covered market, the Grand Bazaar of Isfahan, which was lined with scores of caravanserais, mosques, madrasas, and bathhouses. Yet while relishing the beauties in passing, one must not pause on the way until reaching the Takhtgah. Adjoining the shrine of Harun Velayat, the Takhtgah and its drinking establishments were among the most famous social venues of Isfahan. Here, 100 coffee houses were located side by side, according to one source, and one could find large crowds of people gathering to drink coffee, smoke tobacco, and visit the shrine. At the Takhtgah, which is the first stop on the tour of the old city center of Isfahan, one could linger for a while to smoke a ghalyan, drink a cup of coffee, and gaze at the beauties. And this is the third opportunity for the visitor to take coffee and tobacco. So having walked 2 kilometers through the markets, the visitor deserves the chance to rest and re-stimulate the senses with caffeine to tour the old Isfahan. After this midday rest, one should visit the Harun Velayat shrine before heading toward the old Friday mosque, Masjid Jame Kohneh, which is described as a house of worship on a par with the new Safavid congregational mosque, if not superior to it. Heaven is envious of the mosque's vast space. Its masses of pigeons resemble angels. After visiting the old mosque, one could make a stop at the convent, Khangah of a specific Sufi Nasir, and behold the circle of dervishes. Here the visitor could seek grace and relish the performance of the zikr or Sufi audition at the lodge. Then rather abruptly one should follow the dictum, returning is better, al-Udu Ahmad, and return to the Maidan Nakhsh Jahan. The return to the Maidan Nakhsh Jahan marks the final episode of the tour, but now an entirely new scene awaits the visitor. As dusk begins to fall over Isfahan, the focus of the activities shift from the shaded shopping arcades to the open-air space of the plaza. One is first to take a stroll. Reaching the vast Maidan Nakhsh Jahan, one should rove in space and behold the uproar and frenzy throughout. From the crowding of people, the page of the Maidan is adorned like the sky with planets and stars, resembling the queue and crowds on the day of resurrection. It is hard to come and go, and it is difficult to move. By nightfall, several tented stands and makeshift stages for performances, ma'arakaha, have been set up throughout the square. Scores of jugglers, vendors, storytellers, and acrobats fill the space, turning the plaza into a massive urban spectacle. All of this is too exciting to be missed, so one is instructed to hasten back to the Meydan and Nakhsh Jahan after visiting the old Meydan. Among the urban shows, Semnani recommends the performance of a certain Baba Qasim Rish Deraz, the long-bearded. But to ensure an apt viewing position, one needs to find a spot before the rushing of spectators and the crowding of beholders. Then comes the highlight of the show, Agha Hassan Ali, who is an acrobat and jester and a paragon of comeliness. A painting by Sheikh Abbasi, Safavid painter, represents an acrobat who would have performed in the Meydan. Semnani also recommends watching the wrestling of one Muhammad Kholjani, and this is another Safavid painting in an album collected by Kampfer, the German traveler who depicts a wrestling master supervising two wrestlers. Then comes the darker hours of the night, and after a day of intense strolling, it is now time for other experiences. And if you desire the company and pleasure of the silver-chested, and if you yearn for union and intimacy with the fairy-bodied, in the Art Furushan, flower sellers' quarter, the deceitful and devilish ones are present at the head of every alley, selling the coyness of those whose company is available for a low price. So the first suggestion is the flower sellers' quarter, which was located in the old city. Here, prostitutes are available for a low price of 1 dinar, and brown-faced gandamgun pimps are at the service of customers. Yet while seeking the prostitutes of old Isfahan may be more affordable, it would not be ideal. For a true lover, one needs to visit the district of courtesans. But if you seek a lover whose courtship you can speak of and from whose company you can gain full grace, you must inquire about Kuche No, New Alley. Although due to the improper behavior of some people, the flower of notoriety, Gule Badnami, i.e. syphilis, has blossomed, as has concealed the name of the good ones, there are still numerous graceful, witty mistresses in this clan who are hidden from the eyes and not famous. Kuche No was the quarter of Isfahani courtesans. Courtesans were an integral part of social life for the court and the elites in Safavid Isfahan. There were 12,000 courtesans who paid taxes to the government by one account, and at times the upper story chambers around the Meydan were rented out to courtesans who plied their trade in the markets after dusk. Having explained the status of courtesans, Semnani proceeds to describe the one who he cherished the most without stating her name. He first extols the courtesan in a tour de force of breathless prose, 53 rhyming adjectives that deal with the physical attributes and demeanor of the subject, and then in a lengthy poem, which is the longest poem in the work, that thoroughly describes her body. The literary representation of a courtesan as an object of the male gaze and desire finds a counterpart in a ubiquitous subject of Safavid paintings, which is a recumbent female figure. And this is one elaborate example dating from the 1640s, a painting by Mir Afzal Tuni. The nightly dalliance with the courtesan constitutes the concluding episode of the whirlwind urban excursion. Yet it does not mark the end of the composition. In accord with the conventional ending of epistolary communication, Semnani closes the text with a poem addressed to his friend. In a compelling yet surprising coda to this dramatic representation of Isfahan's pleasures, Semnani advises Rukneddin to take a wife from the beauties of Isfahan and enjoy life, concluding the text with these two lines of poetry. O you, the one from a selected rood, I have asked of God 4 things for you, a desired lover and pure wine, a joyous mind and ample gold. Very good poem. Okay, to conclude, the guide for strolling in Isfahan was composed by a young man of noble provincial background and was presented as a letter addressed to a friend with whom he appears to have journeyed to Isfahan. Semnani and Rukneddin were among the scores of young men who were attracted to the Safavid capital in search of work, learning, fame, and pleasure. The emergence of Isfahan as a metropolitan city had clearly led to a sharper dichotomy between the metropolis and the province in early modern Iran. Visiting the capital offered a host of new experiences, coffeehouses, crowds, brothels that were rarely encountered in the provinces. Isfahan's role as an emporium of the early modern world played a key role in the formation of these new urban experiences. Consider all the novel commodities, social venues, and people that make up this urban experience. Coffee houses, tobacco shops, Armenian vendors, European paintings, and so forth. It was the integration of these novel phenomena into the spatial structure of the city that engendered this unique urban experience. The guide celebrates the intensity and immensity of all urban pleasures, and above all, the possibility of anonymous solitary wandering in a metropolis. Seen through the lens of urban experience, what Isfahan shared with its contemporaneous early modern cities was not its status as a seat of a centralized state or the erection of iconic monuments as emblems of imperial authority. Rather, like its counterparts across the globe, Isfahan constituted a cosmopolitan setting that nurtured new modalities of living and experience. The social behaviors, tastes, and desires that came with new materials and commodities, fused with those that were inherited from the past, were framed and shaped by the built environment. Multisensory experiences, spatial configurations, and public institutions operated in concert to engender a form of urbanity that was not only more cosmopolitan, but also more ambiguous, individualized, and fragmented than what existed before. Without the city, the drifting human subject of Semnani's guide would not have existed. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this beautiful talk. It was enjoyable in the book to read your translations of the poem and the way you embedded these translations in the landscape of the city, in the monuments, and enlivened the whole thing with the mixing of, with actually looking at the architecture through the eyes of the user. And again, you're identifying the user as this young male desiring youth. What I thought was very effective is this idea of the creation of the new type of individual, the sort of the flaneur, the individual who is discerning, who is deciding on his own stroll and the own experiences that he would have with the city. And I thought it was incredible that he started his stroll sort of in the area of the coffee houses and the water pipes and so on. Then he went across the Naqshi Jahan to the mosque, mentioned the call for prayer and praying, and then went back and went to the old bazaar, so there were this mixing, this beautiful representation of the choices that he made. And those choices were to visit specific parts of the city. He didn't go to the Chahar Bagh, he didn't go to that area which lends itself more to the sensorial in a sense, other than the food and drink and the service of the courtesans. He mixed that eating, drinking, praying, visiting the mosque with listening to the hustle and bustle of the city, which I thought was incredibly unique from our modern perspective, where we think of people as either religious or secular, but can't be both. So that was striking. But the most striking thing for me was that he really didn't choose to cross to Chaharbagh and all its pleasures, and we are in the 1650s.
Right. Yeah.
So in a sense, how do you let me start by this question, and then we'll open it up both for the audience here and the audience online for questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the great question. So I have two answers to that. One has to do with the particularity of the genre. So this is a genre of Shahrashu, which is by definition focused on the markets. So really the main fabric, as I hope my translation shows that the main fabric of the text is engaged with inventing metaphors of love based on different craftspersons so he's kind of within that. But on the other hand, he says this is just a sample, right? And it's just a one-day tour, right? So if you go to the Chaharbagh, there is a coffee house, but there's just one. But if you want to go and explore all the coffee houses, as you mentioned, all the food, that kind of intensity of experience could be represented when the tour is focused on the market and the areas of the Maidan. And it's another interesting aspect of the text is just a one-day tour, like from the daybreak to midnight, and that also new in Persian literary production of having the time of the event corresponding to the time of the text. So there we have one very interesting account of Semnani when he goes back to Semnan and establishes a coffee house. There's an ambassador from Samarkand who goes to Isfahan, and on his way back to Samarkand, he spends a few days in Semnan, and he talks about the coffee house of Semnani, and he relates an anecdote where there was one day Semnani and his fellow friends were in the coffee house, and in the entire day from the morning to the afternoon, they dedicated the day to reading just one poem, and then they repeatedly read it, and it was a poem where recounting an affair that happened in a bathhouse, and he says that, and then everybody in the coffee house went to the bathhouse to see the scene where the affair that had appeared. So there is this kind of we can imagine this text being read in the coffee house in Semnan and sort of evoking all the pleasures and senses and foods and stimulants spaces of Isfahan.
And just so that you know, we have Sahlab here. Sahlab, we call it Sahlab here in Toronto, so you can get it.
Okay, good. Yeah. You do have Sangak as well, right?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely, we do. Fahmida?
Thank you so much for just this wonderful talk, and I really look forward to reading the book now. I have two questions, very different. The first one is related to female agency or women's presence, and I know you allude to the courtesans, but could you speak a bit more broadly about women's roles in Isfahan and in the strolling and enjoyment culture, if you could? That's one. And then the second one, a little anachronistic perhaps, but I was thinking of the Pardeh paintings, the coffee house paintings of the Qajar period, and how many of them had religious stories on them, or even epic stories on them. And I wondered, is that a purely Qajar phenomenon, or was there a transition from the Safavid period in terms of storytelling in the coffee houses, and it kind of reached some sort of a painting apogee in the Qajar period?
Okay, yeah, thank you for those questions. I'll start with the second question, which is the easier question. So yeah, I mean, we do have literary evidence of the practice of telling stories from the Pardeh, from Isfahan actually, right? There are references to, I don't think I haven't come across anything in terms of material evidence, but there is literary evidence that there's a reference to a poet, to a storyteller who used the screens to tell a story. And the storytellers were very active, Shahnameh, everything, in the coffee houses, particularly in the Safavid period. So I'm very much aware, that's why I'm putting a lot of emphasis on the viewer being a male viewing subject, right? And this is the experience of an elite male person, right? So there is a lot to be done on the experience of women beyond just courtesans, right? In the city. So we have this interesting reference to the idea of the and I talk about it in another chapter of the book. The charbagh being used once a week by women alone, so they would just make it a quraq, like a male-free space. So the entire charbagh and the Alahverdi Khan Bridge on the Zayanda Rud River was just, became a place of female sociability. We know that Armenian women also participated, so it was sort of a kind of a female space on the scale of a city. Every week they go there. It's like it's a methodology that we need to adopt is the methodology of subaltern studies, right? I mean, we have to read between the texts to sort of reconstruct the experience of marginalized groups, whether it's just Armenians or working class people, quote unquote working class people. And women. So I was so, there was a lot to be said with the text. But I'm very aware of that this is just a experience of a specific group, and we need to do more to reconstruct the urban experience of all people of Isfahan. Yeah.
There's a question online.
Nariman Safavid, please unmute yourself and ask the question.
Sure. It's a brilliant book. I'm looking forward to reading it. I can't wait to do that. I am thinking about, in terms of the sort of assumptions that there might have been in the way that the city might have been designed. It seems like, as opposed to a lot of European cities of that time, they were designed to create an awestruck sense of beauty that ultimately were supposed to be making the citizen, average visiting citizen over there, and sort of obedient and just awestruck by the ruler. While it seems like from your description of Isfahan, it was almost designed to engage the average citizen, the visitor that was coming in. And there seems to be an element of in what you're describing today these days, not just design for beauty, but what today we call design thinking and design strategy, which is supposed to engage the other person, the consumer of the product. It's used a lot of time in designing of the consumption materials and other spaces. That design strategy is supposed to take the human element and engaging the human into account. Am I correct to detect a little bit of that in terms of what you described?
Sure, yeah, there's definitely an element of engaging the users in the very design of it, but maybe, you also hinted at that. So there is the imperial design and engaging the citizens, creating a new kind of human subject, like a subject of the empire, but also human subject, was definitely an intention behind the whole design of Isfahan under Shah Abbas. But not everything goes along the imperial plans. So one example are the coffee houses, right? So definitely the king wanted to have bustling coffee houses so that the citizens are coming and enjoying it. But when people go to the coffee houses and talk about politics, he doesn't like it. And we have evidence for that Shah Abbas had a mullah going to the coffee houses, preaching people, go back to work, don't waste your time. So it's like, maybe there's an authoritarian regime that provides amenities for the citizens, but the way in which they are used are not always going to be the way they were planned. And this is, the whole excursion in the city that this text represents. It doesn't really follow. There's not a single praise of the king. There's no mention of it. This is completely sort of a way of owning the city, and as that is sort of separate from imperial intentions.
Thank you. Michael?
Thank you so much. This is such a wonderful book. The descriptions are so beautiful and evocative, and you're right there with them. I'm wondering about the afterlife of the text and how it was meant to be used. So is this meant to really, you mentioned there are multiple copies, manuscript copies. Do we have a sense from the manuscripts if these were meant to entice people to come visit Isfahan? Were they really meant to follow the itinerary? Was this meant to be more sort of a synopsis, kind of performance? You wouldn't have to leave your Semnan or your Lar to really experience the place, so it's something you could imagine. And that way it links up to literary texts about pilgrimage, where you wouldn't have to necessarily do the pilgrimage itself, you can imagine the pilgrimage. So I'm just wondering, do we have a sense from the range of manuscripts, where they were produced, who used them, possibly, and so forth, about how the text was meant to really be used after?
Or just to add, as a tourist guide.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that it was meant more to be a literary representation rather than a text that to be followed, right? It was meant to be. It follows the format of a guide, a Dastur al-Amal, to evoke that kind of experience. So that's the novelty of the text. It's more like a literary representation, and it's a. In the chapter leading up to this chapter, I discuss other texts that were produced in the period. So we have about 9 or 10 works that are descriptions of Isfahan that date from the period between 1650s and 1670s. So there is definitely a kind of a discourse on the city. We can talk about readers, listeners, or who are taking an interest in, let's represent the city, right? And most of these manuscripts are small-scale safinas, right? Safina are these elongated book codices, right? And these were mostly meant to be like personalized collections of literature, right? So, and it's interesting that they're coming from these provincial cities, and one reason is that a lot of texts didn't survive in Isfahan. There might have been others in the city as well, but that sort of suggests that these literary works, enjoyed a level of fame and interest in their period. And it's this is a period that traditionally is studied as sort of the period of the Indian style, Sabke Hindi, right? But there's also, there's a Sabke Hindi of Sa'ib and Kalim, but there's also Sabke Hindi of the Bazaar, and these were taken very seriously by the period audiences. Although 20th century audiences sort of were more interested in Sa'ib and Kalim rather than these. But when you look at the manuscript, you see works of Sa'ib and Kalim together with works of Semnani and other, now less known poets being in the same anthology.
Can I just add very quickly that you in one of the chapters you mentioned that in the manuscript collection that you found was the Semnani's letter and the original letter from
Rukneddin
together.
Right,
so
right.
they were collected together. Do we know when? Do we know why they were put together?
So this particular manuscript is a manuscript of epistolary composition, so examples of the Insha, and these two were put together as other examples of Insha. And that's a manuscript that has other Insha works by Semnani. And other texts are also fascinating, so we learned from them that he was in sort of constant communication with friends in Isfahan, from Semnan, and writing a letter is not just a letter. It's not for one person. It's a literary genre of literary creation, right? And it was clearly seen and perceived as such.
Thank you for the very beautifully immersive talk. It's a little bit adjacent to Hamida's question. So you give us this, experience of Semnani's or account of Semnani's experience of the city as a site of social encounters, cultural encounters, but they're also gendered encounters. But women kind of come in as nocturnal figures, so they only come out at night. And I wonder, how you navigate that or how you think about that, because certainly there are women that are existing during the day also that he's not writing about that are there in the city that are, as musicians, as craft workers. So they exist in the city, but he only brings them out at night. If I'm reading it correctly, what you're saying, like that in the text they appear as night, and it's the dancers and or not the dancers, the prostitutes and the courtesans that appear. In fact, the dancers are male.
Dancers are male. Yeah, dancers are all male. Yeah. So it's there's a kind of dichotomy definitely in the text, right? Male beauty is associated with the market. It's mostly facial beauty, where you get to the night, you have the full body experience, so the representation of the woman. So I think that's part of the representational strategy. I would interpret it as something intentional in that sense. But I mean, it's again interesting that it's bringing them together. But I mean, we read from the other sources that sort of courtesans began to kind of go out in the markets after daybreak. So there is that it kind of accords with that kind of description of the activity. So if they were, so it's at the end of the workday, where going to the caravanserais and sort of it kind of makes sense for that time to start doing their business, but it's. I mean, what is interesting about Isfahan is that this kind of male and female beauty are both brought together. There's a lot of debate among literary historians whether the ma'shuq in Saadi is male or female, and it's kind of always gender. The gender is not clear, but and people have very kind of firm ideas that this is definitely male, this is definitely female. But it's both, and it's so fluid. Notions of beauty and desire are just so fluid in this period that it's difficult to say. But I hope I answered your question.
We have another question online.
There's a written question by Sarah Brahman. Thank you for your interesting presentation. I believe your approach is similar to the semiotic approach, exploring how architecture impacts people's perception and how they experience space. My question is a bit different, but it might help me with my own research. As you mentioned, it is a one-day tour. Do you think the time frame affects people's perception? Also, do you think there is a difference in perception between regular people and professionals, such as architects or artists, and perhaps perception of the city itself?
Sure. Yeah, definitely. I mean, the one day, limiting it to one day is just this representational strategy. It makes it more intense, right? And he also suggests that it's a Friday, right? Do it on Friday is the day of the week where you're not doing business. So if you want to go, so that's kind of element of realism in it. Speaking of semiotics, I was not very much inspired by semiotics. I was inspired by the literature on sort of urban experience, the difference between imperial designer's view and the user's view. So Michel de Certeau, Practice of Everyday Life, that's one source. I read a lot. I mean, Ruba, you mentioned the flaneur, right? I read the literature on flaneur, and these are cited. And I compared this figure with the figure of the flaneur. I think the correct term, in my view, for describing this kind of person is a proto-flaneur, right? There are elements of sort of anonymous individual engagement with the city, but we're not speaking about the sort of Baudelairean flaneur who's in search of sort of an epiphany and sort of an artist flaneur. There's still a guide, right? A guide that is sort of gives us some kind of a structure to urban experience. There are choices that are made, but the choices are presented as sort of very strict, right? This is what you should do. And but there are also, on the other hand, new elements like coffee houses, like being anonymous. It's interesting because it's an individual tour, not a group tour. Yeah, that's an interesting choice. But
it's a guided tour.
Guided tour, individual guided tour, right? That's what makes it, maybe proto-flaneur. I mean, so there are similarities and there are differences.
Maria?
Thank you very much for this very evocative. It's a completely different way of thinking about looking at a city. And I'm thinking of some of the older literature of Hamid, who's writing about Isfahan as well, and his experience in Isfahan. So I have to think about that, kind of in a different way. But my question is, the images that you showed of the city, were all very graphic, European. They're almost all European drawings. Well, I think all of them exclusively. Yet the Iranian perception of the city is in a literary. So you don't have any representations of the city, right? In any probably you have architectural drawings.
Yeah.
Architectural drawings. But there's nothing that would portray the city in that graphic type. When does it start? Does it ever start? When do you start having depictions of Isfahan or any other Iranian city in the way that we see in Tavernier or Keto de Ravala or these other either travelers or merchants?
Right, yeah. Maybe Michael can
maybe about this question, the person who was doing a back walkover, that was, I thought, an Iranian, wasn't it? He was doing a back bend.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, but what Maria is asking is that we don't have a representation of actual physical spaces.
Yeah.
We do have a lot of representations of actual people, but not the spaces. And this is right. That's an interesting phenomenon. So even in manuscript paintings, we do have more in terms of representations of architecture in Timurid painting. But when we get an early Safavid painting, when you get to the 17th century, Reza Abbasi, and becomes all about humans, there one way of accounting for that I thought might be helpful is that this emphasis on a multi-sensory experience of the city. The city is not just a visual phenomenon. It's that all the senses are there. There's the olfactory sense, the sense of hearing sense. All of them are activated in them. And there's a great amount of synesthesia in the text. Constantly mixing all the senses, and so maybe that's one reason to account for it.
But I think the point is that it really is a literary engagement first and foremost.
Right.
And I think that has a very deep history.
Yeah.
Say, Haqqani, if you go back to his description of Isfahan or his description of the Ivan Madayan, that's also multisensory. It's like,
Right.
You're crying
Right.
there, you're getting this whole experience. And he says, go there, take a look, stop, get off your horse or your camel or whatever. So I think what you're describing probably has very deep roots.
Sure, definitely. I mean, what I'm suggesting is new is just the intensity, maybe, and the multisensory intensity, integration of. Maybe I'm putting too much weight on coffee houses, coffee and tobacco, and sort of that kind of and the idea of there's a sense of an individual, a relatively stronger sense of an individual subject that I feel we don't see in earlier literary representations. And one thing is that this is a mix of prose and verse. So prose allows for a greater degree of, not necessarily, but there's a greater degree of realism in the representation of the spaces. Yeah, definitely it has roots, and I discussed the roots. I'm aware of I'm not saying it's sort of entirely new, but I mean the intensity, the anonymous wandering in a metropolis. So that there's also a major difference. You go in a city, but you can go incognito, right?
I think the coffee house definitely is. You did mention smoking in the coffee house.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Tobacco coming from the Americas and all of it. Michael, you want?
Just in terms of depictions, I think you're very well aware of depictions of potentially architecture at one time in spaces that one finds in Isfahan, for example, the illustrations that are attributed to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Right, yeah.
In Shah Hamid, sort of, I think it's in the CV, in the Chester video.
Right, yeah.
So a Shah Hamid that shows potentially some of the glacial spaces, some of the Palisade spaces in Isfahan. Also, there are some depictions of portraits of rulers that would have been in albums that have depictions of the city in the background. And those also date from the 17th century. I think even perhaps more relevant to your talk, however, a series of albums that do show youth participating as practitioners of different crafts. So you have a series of depictions of youth as craftspeople, whether they're hammering on an anvil or sewing or whatever, but they would have been compiled and in a sense sort of form a visual counterpart to the shakashu. So you have craftsperson, and as you flip through these albums, you will imagine sort of having a visual analog to the experience of reading shakashu as a sort of tour through the city via its own
Yeah, definitely. These are urban representations. A lot of these paintings are also inspired by Shahrashu, but it's interesting that until the 1670s, 80s, when we get to Muhammad Zaman and Ali Qoli Jabadar, we really have very little in terms of graphic representation of urban spacings as gardens.
Muhammad first.
Thank you for your outstanding presentation. With the way you have outlined the book and the journey, it seems to me here you have the physical space, urban space, as the foundation, as the grounding for the formation of what is referred to as the modern individual. In a sense that the whole sense of individuality is through a horizontal sort of journey, radical, rather than the vertical journeys of literary, spiritual nafs. And experiencing different sites and different parts of the city itself, again, at the heart of it is the individual experience. Yes, this is a guided tour, but we could also imagine an individual maybe informed by that, going through the route and experiencing all of these things on her own or on his own.
Yeah, I entirely agree. This is my conclusion.
Yeah.
But again, we need to use this early modern individual because, I mean, this is an early modern subjectivity. That's why I think the periodization early modern would be very helpful for this period. It's not an entirely modern subject, but sort of is, and again becomes, I mean, the problem is that it could be interpreted as being teleological, right? But it's an early modernity that leads to modernity. And I discussed this, the teleological connotations in the conclusion, but I entirely agree with you. There's an individual experience that is coming through in a bold manner that we don't see it in earlier literature, I would argue.
Yeah. Thank you.
We have a question online.
Yes, Azana Khatam asks, there was a massive construction, as you mentioned, in this period, and 3 new quarters have been added to the old city. This new neighborhood was integrated to the old city through Naqsh Jahan and Qaysariye Bazar. It is interesting that one-day tour of the city, which starts from the new plaza and goes into the old city, does not mention any conflicting cultural practices like Friday prayers at the old mosque, or for example. So is it because Semnani wants to focus on specific events or specific professions rather than, for example, there was no mention of wine houses, and Isfahan had some wine houses. So she's asking whether it was specifically geared toward certain kind of practices or professions or events.
Sure, we kind of discussed it in the first question of, the focus on the market. It's the literary genre of Shahrashu, which sort of focuses on that. And maybe it's a good question to think about, again, the contradictions of the rise of the modern individual, early modern individual, if you can talk about it, is there's a great deal of harmony in the representation. Everything is just, it's a bustling city which you can have all the funds, everything is there, and in a very coordinated, choreographed tour, you can experience all of that. And that's kind of was part of the imperial intention as well, right? I mean,
Cosmopolis.
Cosmopolis creating that. So this is, okay, Shahbaz, you did a great job. You created, be a person who can come and sort of be an individual and be very happy. So that was also part of the imperial project as well. It's just because you mentioned harmony of the experience and all of that. No contradiction is there. Armenians, they're just objects of desire and love. Everything is in just perfect harmony, and but so yeah, that sort of contradicts with all the tensions that were going on in the city at the time.
It was funny because when you mention Armenians, he says in the book that you have to go beyond Kufr and Islam. You have
Right,
to, you
right.
have to be, in line with everything else to enjoy it. Otherwise, you can't enjoy it. If you assume Armenians are others, basically, then you can't enjoy their quarters, basically.
Right. And it's again, I mean, there's a Safavid policy of sort of forced conversion from Sunnism to Shiism, but on the other hand, you have this cosmopolitan capital city with Armenians and Zoroastrians, so there are all these, it's all in the service of power, right? To create an image of a cosmopolitan city, while also, on the other hand, it's more in the service of power to sort of suppress the Sunni population. So.
Thank you very much for such a wonderful lecture and for Scotland, exciting. I would like to know, according to one of the photos you shared with us, that the server who is serving the tea, excuse me, I'm actually not sure if that's from Safavid era. Forgive me, I'm not coming from art background. But I would like to know if there was a certain group, because the look of that server was more like a Mongolian kind of look. I know in a cosmopolitan place like Isfahan in Safavid era, so we have to expect probably many, different type of look. However, I would like to know if there was a certain group of people who were associated with working or serving at the tea houses in the Safavid, or specifically at Naqsh Jahan context, maybe. Do you have any idea about that?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I would say a lot of these representations are following the conventions that were established. So these are entirely idealized faces, right? And the ideal of beauty is coming from sort of a kind of ideal beauty that looks more East Asian to us today. But I mean, that sort of goes back to that. But about your second question, yeah, we know that there were Georgian boys who were sort of worked in the coffee houses, and they're very much mentioned.
And was that an advantage or it was disadvantage?
It was a form of child labor, which is suppression. These were, Georgians were Christians. A lot of them were sort of forced into these kind of labors in Isfahan.
I have another question related to that idea of Shahrashub, and again, it struck me when I read the chapter on the Chaharbagh, and then when I read the poem. When I read the chapter on the Chaharbagh, there is this incredible investment in water structures, water infrastructure, not only the canals and the reflecting pools and the bridges and the river and the lake on the river later, and then we have this poem this insha that is dealing with Shahrashub, so dealing with the market. And what struck me all the way through when I'm reading the chapter on Jata Shaharbagh and when I read the poem is, where are the fountains? In a sense, I was thinking comparatively to Ottoman Istanbul, to Shireen Hamade's book, to the notion of patronage, where merchants usually give them a bit of infrastructure, they will invest in that, and they would have these little waqfs, and fountains are the perfect waqfs because they're very cheap, you're building on an existing infrastructure, and the only time there's fountains mentioned are in the Saadabad, the fountains in the pool. And I thought that's, in a sense, for me, missing from seeing that tour in the market. Are merchants doing something, investing in the city, building something? We know that there are waqfs. So it struck me as a missing link in both chapters.
Right. Yeah, that's an excellent question. Thank you for that. Armenian merchants were definitely building all the churches and houses of Nujulfar were sponsored by Armenian merchants. But you're right. We need to do more research on the patronage of Muslim Tabrizi merchants, like they were also very wealthy. Were they building more than that? We know that a lot of eunuchs and court ladies, especially in this period of the mid 17th century, women are more active as patrons of madrasas. Especially royal ladies are more active. Safavid wazirs are also very active. But I need to do more research on that. Yeah, but that's an important question. And the whole, it's interesting the contrast with 18th century Istanbul in terms of a sponsorship of fountains. So you have this network of water canals and which are very closely regulated, and there's a great deal of water engineering going into sort of just having those water. You need to have very precise leveling for all the fountains and all of them. That's also an area of research unto itself, right? Yeah.
Anwar also, Anwar
Right.
Fahmida?
You mentioned tea, and I was curious about, so before the coffee came about, everyone was drinking tea, and there were tea houses, weren't there? Were they supplanted by coffee houses? Did you only drink coffee outside of the home, and tea was the thing that people drank?
Good. Tea was known. There we have references to chai khatai khane, the chai tea house, Chinese tea house. But main drink was coffee. Coffee was the most popular. Everywhere was coffee. And Rudy Mata has written extensively on the shift from coffee to tea from the 18th century and to the Qajar period. But in this period, in the 17th century, coffee is the drink, and coffee houses where people would go.
Question here?
The description was very vivid, so it made you feel like going in through a coffee house hopping. But you mentioned a couple of things that he was highlighting which were new. So going out for coffee in the mornings was new, and the glass mirrors were new. Is there something you read into why they were being highlighted, or was it just a coincidence?
Oh, I think that's sort of what's motivating. Whether consciously or unconsciously, we don't know. But without these, elements, the tour wouldn't be as intense as it is. So that's for sure. So drinking coffee in the morning. So the common practice before Isfahan, before the 17th century, was to take 2 meals a day. So there was the chasht. Chasht was a kind of a light meal, taken later in the morning. But then there was the more substantial dinner. And with the introduction of coffee, now you have a 3-meal sequence, which is what we know do today, right? You take a coffee with a little sweet in the morning, and then chasht is pushed back toward the noon, and we get, these are, it's a kind of a materials history a little bit. Maybe that's a little bit unconscious in my work, that materials have agency, they come and they change everything. But if you just take out mirrors and coffee and tobacco and all the city, and then you wouldn't get that experience, right?
Maria?
Very brief question, because if I heard you correctly, you said there was a time where the Naqsh Jahan was reserved just for women.
No.
The Chaharbagh was just reserved. Yeah.
And the term you used was Furuk.
Furuk, yeah.
Was that just for that time, or was
No.
the Chaharbagh generally designated as a Furuk?
So Qurugh was a common practice, starting with the Mongols, right? But Qurugh was more like at the whim of the ruler. We're going to do Qurugh in the bazaar, and then it's going to be...
It's a very interesting evolution of that.
Right, to become a weekly practice, which is again entirely new. Routinized, kind of a... We don't have any... yeah, exactly. Yeah, there were, right, exactly, yeah. This is... The text is very rich, I should say that.
It's a very rich text. Mohammed?
Well, linked to the formation of the individual is also the formation of public spaces, public sphere, and coffee houses are essential to it. Do you have any traces of public discussions, public debates that you would call the part of this emerging public sphere?
Sure, thank you for that question. We have proto-individual and proto-public sphere as well.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, there is evidence, there's a lot of evidence from the sources that people would go to coffee houses, engage in political discussions. They talk with all freedom in the coffee houses, and there are also reactions. So I could have developed that idea in a separate article I wrote on coffee houses. So I left the question of public sphere and coffee houses into that article, whereas in the book I mostly focused on experience and individual experience. But definitely we can talk about kind of proto-public sphere forming, and that's sort of what binds Safavid territories to Ottoman territories and to Arab lands and to Europe, emerging this kind of coffee house and public sphere, right? In different contexts for different with slightly different approach, environments, but there are a lot of commonalities there.
Which contributes to this notion of global modernity,
exactly,
rather than a modernity that starts in Europe and disseminates everywhere else. It has multiple centers and multiple sites.
If I want to use more like a term that we use now, it's a global early modernity. I mean, which is a period before industrialization.
Michael?
Sorry, just to follow up about this question about novelty and the novelties of the city. There's been a lot of work that's been done in the literary sphere about the new, the idea of the new in this period. Paul Lozensky's work has been really critical in understanding new approaches to poetry, new ways of expressing oneself in this Hindi sort of mode and so forth. But I feel like this is all the literary representation that you've highlighted, Farshid, is part and parcel, and this idea of the new city and the new experiences of the city. There is this real interest in novelty at this time, making something new, but not just making it new. There is that wonderful moment in society where you go to the old part of town, and it's like you need to have that moment of comparison in order to really highlight what is really new here.
Yeah, exactly.
Even saying it's better, this is riff on the call to prayer. It's better to get back to the new city. And go back to the new. So I mean, this is part of this bigger worldview, I feel like.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely.
So there's that. It's all part of it.
Thank you so much for your everything. It was very fantastic.
Thank you.
Following to Professor Tavakkoli's question about the public and private sphere, I wanted to ask you: is there any evidence that the king would show in the public places such as coffee house? Or Sufi house, for example, tower. I just want to see, how much they wanted to show their power in terms of, to prevent from, maybe possible threat.
Shah Abbas would frequently visit the coffee houses. He would even receive ambassadors in a coffee house. I mean, there are lots of anecdotes in the literary sources about the Shah going unplanned going to the coffee houses and engaging with them. So there is this seminal article by Goru Necipoglu, which framing the gaze in Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal palaces, where she analyzed how this particular mode of imperial representation in the city that is based on accessibility of the ruler, going into the coffee houses, engaging in conversation with ordinary citizens. Yeah.
So that would prevent the sort of public debate that they wanted to have, the public. How was it?
But to what extent one person can control everything? That's the thing about it, right? These are institutions that are by nature uncontrollable. When you have a place that you have, so another thing to talk about is just nightlife in Isfahan. Because coffee houses, we hear about a lot of them, they had extensive lighting fixtures, they were very busy, especially after workday. People would go there, there's a limit to how much you can control that kind of social institution.
We have an online question.
It is a rather long question. I was just short. Sorry.
Thank you so much for your inspiring and thought-provoking presentation. I'm particularly interested in your sensory approach to history and literature, as well to the changing cityscapes of Isfahan as experienced by its inhabitants. As a PhD student working on a project about the senses in the Safavid Empire, your research is invaluable to me. It opens my mind to new ways of interdisciplinary thinking about how we can explore history through the senses. How do you see the study of the senses in Safavid history evolving in academic research? Additionally, how we can effectively use literary and artistic sources to further investigate the sensory history of the Safavids from a non-courtly perspective?
Okay, great question.
Well,
like, I mean, I feel my work is also contributing to the sensory studies, which is a burgeoning field. Multidisciplinary studies is by nature multidisciplinary. I think we can. I mean, I have just scratched the surface with literary sources. There is a lot to be extracted from these literary sources. So one good project should be a collaborative project of just editing all these texts and translating them into English so that everybody can use them. Yeah, definitely. I would suggest just delving more into the sources, literary sources, and to reconstruct a fuller multi-sensory history of the senses in Isfahan.
Mhm.
Very good.
Thank you. Further questions here in the room? Well, then we should thank you. You've given us a lot to think about, and actually a very new experience of Isfahan, thinking about it from the perspective of the individual or proto-individual, walking through the city, experiencing it, and leaving us with so much thought about it. It's a beautiful book and it's beautifully written, and thank you so much for joining us here.
Thank you very much.